The Abandoned Miner. This is the story of the Abandoned Miner. It is an entity who lurks in the depths of the deepest caves. People who have come across it have said that its appearance is similar to one of a skeleton and a run-down, old-looking man with torn clothes a worker would wear. To understand the Abandoned Miner, we will learn through a story of someone who encountered them. The player had been playing in their world for a while now, and from what they could tell, there had been no signs of the Abandoned Miner until one day when the player decided to explore the new Deep Slate caves after updating their world to the latest version. They had gathered their tools and some food and set off into a mine that they knew led into a cave they'd found from hours of strip mining days before. They had been anxiously anticipating the new update, and when it came out, they'd immediately begun to dig out a way to get into the Deep Slate. And when they saw the first sign of a fully Deep Slate cave, they had stopped and waited until they had better armor, tools, and collected enough food to last a few hours of constant mining. The player also crafted a beacon and decided it would be a good idea to bring it down with them while they mined. The player waited until the sun finally went down, then set off into the depths of the new caves. They had marked out a perfect strategy to get all of the ore they wanted to build their new home in, and the exact amount of blocks they needed. They had planned to collect materials for at least a few hours. Then, he would begin construction on his new base. The player already had a reasonably sized home, but with the new update, they had decided they would go above and beyond on the base they would create. After a few minutes of walking, they finally reached the opening to the new Deep Slate caves. They were still the old generated ones, but the fact that there was now Deep Slate was a huge change for them. The player entered the cave and took a quick look around it. He could see the different textures of the ores, placed down his beacon, and got to work. A few minutes had passed, and the player was already able to collect a few stacks of Deep Slate and a considerably low amount of ores. Seeing how low he was, and from what he had seen on the info pages, there was supposed to be an increase of ores. The player had shrugged it off at first, but as they continued to mine, they saw that their netherite pickaxe began to break quicker than they had ever seen it decrease in durability. Not only that, the pickaxe had all of the best enchantments on it: Efficiency 5, Unbreaking 3, Fortune 3, and Mending. There would be no reasonable explanation for this to be happening. Their spare diamond pickaxes had the same issue. Even with their maxed enchantments, the player couldn't figure it out, and just excused it as a bug with the new update. Thankfully, the player had some extra enchanting bottles in one of his shulker boxes, and used it to repair their tools by a reasonable amount and continued to mine. The same issues continued to occur as they continued to gain more resources. After a few more minutes, the player decided that they have had enough of mining for today, and would report the issues to Minecraft the next day. They traveled back to the surface and logged out. The next day, the player logged back into their game and went to go check on the amount of Deep Slate they had to see if they could begin some practice on their base. They had left the Deep Slate in a chest down in their mine the night before. As they descended back down the stairs and neared the area where they were mining the night before, they noticed some stark differences. Some of the Deep Slate on the cave's walls and floors had disappeared, and some of it had even turned into regular cobblestone. The player knew for sure that they hadn't placed that cobblestone down, or broken the Deep Slate in those specific spots. But there was no other explanation other than Endermen spawning and taking some of the Deep Slate blocks and placing some cobblestone down in the empty spaces while they weren't paying attention. The player had no choice but to shrug it off again, and decided they would make a report to some of the feedback sections on Minecraft's website. They had been able to make more tools when they logged back on, and had a much more consistent supply of iron, diamond, and even some netherite pickaxes. Some were even enchanted. The player had the materials to spare, and made sure to enchant them with Unbreaking 3. As they resumed their progress from yesterday, they noticed that they were mining considerably slower than the day prior, and decided to check on their beacon. The beacon was still working fine, but when they checked the effects, it said speed instead of haste. They were confused, but just assumed it was a bug among other things in their world at the moment, and changed it back to how it was supposed to be, and resumed mining. Again, the majority of their pickaxes were broken, with little durability left. While they had been mining, they'd taken some time to go onto the Minecraft forums and request help from a moderator. But even they didn't know what was happening. The player checked their chests full of resources and put all of it in some of their shulker boxes and decided to go back up to the surface again. Once they got back up to the surface, they stored the deep slate into a large array of chests they'd placed out minutes after they logged on today. It was already filled with multiple stacks of deep slate, but the player needed at least 5 more stacks to begin construction, and they couldn't do that while their tools were broken. They decided they would go play some mini games and repair their tools later. A few hours later, the player logged back into their world and decided they would begin building the foundations of their new base. They hoped it wouldn't take too long, and they could get some of it done before night fell. When the sun began to set and the player had been able to get the base of the new home finished, they had run out of deep slate. So, when night finally fell, they re-entered the mine with a full inventory of shulker boxes and tools. Once the player reached the small cave they'd been digging out for the past few days, they realized there was really no point in mining deep slate here, since there was no more ore in the area. Or more likely, no more ore that they'd found. They decided to once again dig down a bit further and begin strip mining until he was able to find a new cave with more ore. After a few minutes of digging and repairing his pickaxe, they went. They quickly found a new cave that was twice the size of the one they had previously been in. They realized there would be no point in mining right now, and it was an exhausting task to continuously mine for a few minutes, then repair their pickaxe moments later. They decided to go back up to the surface and log off there, and come back the next day. Once they had logged back on the following day, the first thing the player noticed was that some of the deep slate within the foundations of the house they'd built had turned into cobblestone. They took another look at it to see if they were imagining things, but they weren't. They couldn't really question it, and just assumed it was another bug that the developers would fix later, and quickly made their way down to their strip mine. They walked into the cave, and after glancing around its dark corners, they began exploring and collecting materials like iron, gold, exposed diamonds, and some amethyst and copper. This cave was deeper than the last one, but there was a limitless supply of ores. Even with the darkness of the cave, the dim light from the torches they carried in their offhand lit up his surroundings. Minutes later, their tools were on the verge of breaking once more, like they had gotten used to over the past few days. But in contrast to the other days, they'd been more careful in watching the durability quickly reduce to nothing and reserved some spare tools for if something happened. As they tried to find their way back up to the surface, they found that the torches they'd meticulously placed down as a route to find their way out again had disappeared, and the rest of the torches they'd carried in their inventory had long since been used up. The player had wandered around the cave for a few minutes before finally coming to the realization that they wouldn't be able to find their way out of this cave by wandering around for hours. They had no other choice but to dig upwards and hope they'd reach another cave and be able to find an opening to the surface. And so they did. They kept an extremely careful watch over their tools, and that paid off when they found themselves in a cave, something they'd been searching for what seemed like hours. They ran around the cave for a few minutes, trying to find a way out, but there seemed to be no exit, not from what they could tell. After a few minutes of feverish searching, they stopped themselves and decided to log out, telling themselves that they would be back tomorrow. When they logged back in the next day, they continued their search, but ended up with the same result as the night before. There was no way out. The cave seemed endless and was unforgiving, with sharp drops into what seemed like endless caverns down to bedrock, or maybe even the void. The player knew they weren't exactly regular for a survival world, but they couldn't question that now. They spent a long time in that endless cave before they made the decision to return to the cave they came from, and again attempt to find a way out from there. As they descended back into the old cave, they searched around it for a second time, and eventually were able to find a mine shaft tucked away in one of the corners. The player ventured inside the mine shaft, and as they walked inside of it, they saw a shadowy figure leaning behind a wooden pillar, silently watching the player with cold gray eyes. The player made a move to get closer to the figure, but as they did, it disappeared in an instant, and did not reappear again. They didn't dwell on the strange occurrence any more than a few moments, because they had more compelling matters to deal with compared to a figure that was probably just a glitched mob that had despawned a moment later. One of those matters was the matter of food. They barely had any left after walking through that cave before, but as they wandered through the mineshaft, they found a chest inside of a minecart holding 2 glowing berries and a singular golden apple. The player continued to explore the mineshaft, looking for more chests, but as they did, their hunger continued to diminish. Even if they weren't sprinting, it would still go down. Like the cave from before, the mine shaft would continuously merge into another one, and there wasn't enough durability on their pickaxe to dig out. Every once in a while, they would catch small glimpses of the figure watching them through a translucent cobweb, or behind a wall or wooden pillar, like the one they'd seen first. Eventually, they were able to find their way out of the mine shaft, but by that time, the player had run out of food, and their hunger was draining at an even quicker pace than before. Even if they ate rotten flesh, the hunger would be applied, and their hunger would continue to drain even quicker. As the player walked around trying to find an exit, they realized they were taking damage from just existing within the cave's confines. And they weren't even taking damage at the same time. It was like an invisible force was slowly draining their health, bit by bit. After minutes of aimless wandering, the player suddenly saw a path upwards and towards an opening. They made their way over to it, but as they were slowly climbing the first block, the player was suddenly given a blindness effect out of nowhere, and even with the effect, they still tried to walk towards the direction of the opening, but without much avail. The player then sees an opening, but with blindness, still tries to walk in the direction of it. It took the effect a few moments to disappear, but once it did, the player found themselves in a large open cavern full of cobblestone. They checked their coordinates, and it was right where the deep slate should be the most abundant and was most compacted. But instead, there was just cobblestone, with no way out. The player was still starving without any food, and the only thing that they could do was attempt to mine out. However, as they did so, they quickly realized there were no openings to different caves leading to the surface. There were no ore pockets. There were only some abandoned mine shafts the player occasionally found. The player had run into countless small mine shafts and had to craft a multitude of stone pickaxes using the wood found after the remaining ones had broken. But even so, there was seemingly no way out from the small opening they appeared in. The player had no choice but to log out and try again later. Once the player logged back into the game, they found themselves in another opening with the exact same shape. But when they tried to mine with their remaining tools, they found even less mine shafts. If they tried doing this again, they would come across the same result, except the mine shafts would become even less frequent and incredibly rare. One of the last times the player found themselves in a mine shaft, they came across the figure once more. With the numerous times they had found a mine shaft, they had continued to catch glimpses of the strange figure, but could never get close enough to figure out who, or rather what, it was. But this time, the figure appeared in front of the player. They had a sign in their inventory, something they'd created with the little materials they had on them, and asked the figure who it was, and dropped it, their last remaining pickaxe, in hopes that it would give them answers. It didn't say anything, just stared blankly, then disappeared. Along with its disappearance, the rest of the wood in the surrounding area disappeared as well, and the last thing it left behind was a sign that read, "The caves are infinite." The player's last resort and final option was to die in the game. And once that had happened, they realized there would be no turning back. When they hit the respawn button, they didn't reappear back at their house on the surface. They found themselves in the same large cavern with a singular sign on the wall that read, "There's no way out." Let me know if you have any scary stories or experiences within Minecraft. Comment it down below. And massive shout out to my super supporters who joined by hitting the join button next to the subscribe button, or click the link down in the description below. And as always, I will see you next time.